Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today we have a special guest at the Timmy the Toolman studios, and that's my buddy Ryan, who I work with at the same fire department. And what we're going to do today for Ryan is we are going to do a AHC delete. AHC stands for automatic height control. He has a Lexus LX470, which would be the same as a 100 series Land Cruiser. And what ends up happening over time is people have issues with that automatic height control suspension system. And instead of spending a lot of time and a lot of money diagnosing and fixing that system, some guys just decide to delete the hydraulic system and go to a conventional system of regular shocks and springs. I'm going to now turn it over to Ryan, and Ryan is going to describe the kit he chose to buy and some of the symptoms he was experiencing that made him want to do this job. Here's Ryan.
Hi, like Timmy said, my name's Ryan, and I have a 2000 LX470. I bought it about 6 years ago when my wife was going to school out in Colorado, and it is an amazing vehicle. Only problem with it is, as it starts to age, the elasticity of that AHC system, that hydraulic system, starts to go, and you start experiencing problems like, the only way I could describe it would be, it feels like your shocks are too stiff at times. For example, one time we were driving on the freeway and I hit a grade, and I actually hit it and it blew my tire, left me stranded. Recently what I've been noticing is it's soft when you're driving slow, but really harsh when you're driving fast. It's also very sloppy and you get a ton of body roll. So it's time for us to delete that. I looked into different kits like the Old Man Emu and this one by Iron Man. The reason why I decided to go with Iron Man, besides a small cost differential, was I really still want a softer ride, and everything that I was reading about the Old Man Emu is you're going to get a little bit harsher of a ride than the Iron Man. So I wanted to test it out, especially because there just is not much information about these lifts. So for about, I think it was about 800 bucks or so, I was able to get this kit. It came with 4 shocks, front and back. It came with 2 rear springs, and it came with 2 torsion bars for the front. I've got no experience working with torsion bars besides the fact that they're on our fire engines. So we'll see how that goes. But other than that, they came with some of these brackets that we'll figure out where to throw these guys. So we'll see how it goes.
With this job, there is an option for you to take it one pretty big step further and remove all the components that make up the AHC system. So say for instance you were going to make your Lexus LX470 or your 100 series Land Cruiser into more of a overland vehicle, and you wanted to put weld-on rock sliders on. Well, because those actuators are along the frame rails, they're going to get in your way of putting rock sliders on, so you might want to just delete those off the frame rail and disconnect everything. So that's an option that we are going to maybe pursue in the future with Ryan as a part 2 to this video. We're going to remove all the components that make up the AHC system. But for now, for this video, we're going to concentrate on replacing the front shocks, rear shocks, torsion bars, and the rear springs. With all that said, we're going to get out to the rig and we're going to start working on this thing.
So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing the fluid out of the height control reservoir. There's a reservoir here in the engine compartment that's located right here. There's a motor underneath, and the motor provides the pressure to the hydraulic system that goes inside of the shocks. We're going to be using this tool here. We took off the cap, remove fluid. We'll keep going here until all the fluid's out.
Right now we have the front end of the truck jacked up and it's supported on jack stands on both sides. We went ahead and removed the front and rear skid plate. The front one is metal, the rear one's plastic. It's held on by 12mm bolts. We didn't bother showing it because we figured you would know how to do that. It's pretty self-explanatory. Take all the 12mm bolts that hold the 2 skid plates on. Then we got underneath the center cross member, underneath the engine, this one right here, and we jacked up right up underneath there, and then we settled the truck on jack stands on both frame rails. And then as you see, we have both front wheels off. So now the next step is we are going to tackle getting the front shock absorbers off the vehicle. First thing we have to do is remove pressure off the system, so when we remove the two nuts that hold the fluid line on top of the shock absorber, it's not going to spew out hydraulic fluid in our face, which would be a bad thing. So let's show you how to do that. We're on the passenger side of the vehicle on the front. This is called a dampening force control actuator. You have 4 of them, 1 for each shock absorber. So this one sends fluid to the front shock absorber, and we want to depressurize the system so hydraulic fluid doesn't fly into our face when we disconnect the line on top of the shock. This has a bleed nipple right here, just like you would see a bleed nipple on a brake caliper. I'm going to take this plastic cover off to get it out of my way. It just has a little hoop that goes over the nipple. I'm going to use a flare nut wrench, 10 millimeter. I'm going to get it on there. And now I'm going to get a drain hose to where when the fluid comes out, I can direct it where I want it. So this is just a little hose that I got at O'Reilly's. So it's slid over. I'm going to now break it free, and you're going to see fluid come out of here. We already did the driver's side, so we don't know if doing the driver's side first is going to affect this and have less pressure on it, but let's see what happens. It doesn't have much pressure in it, so doing the other side first took pressure off the system. When we did the driver's side, this thing was flowing like crazy with a fair amount of force. It appears that the other side is going to affect this side. Just know when you crack the first one, a lot of pressure is going to be coming out, and you want your face out of the path of that by using a hose. Direct it into a drain pan. Here's the fluid line that attaches to the top of the shock absorber. In order to have a little bit more room to work, I'm just going to use this plastic clip removal tool, get behind these clips of the plastic fender liner and pop them free. And that should be enough. I'm just going to stuff this in here so it's out of my way so I can work right here. The next thing I'm going to remove is 2 12 millimeter nuts that hold this fluid line on top of the shock absorber. I'm just going to use a gear wrench, box end wrench to loosen those. This thing is going to be on there fairly tight. You can just wiggle it with your hand, or you can use a little pry bar or screwdriver to help you out. I'm going to use a little pry bar, and this is the point where if you didn't relieve the pressure on the system, as you're breaking this free, it's going to just shoot hydraulic fluid right in your face. Be careful. There we go. A little bit's going to leak out on you, but most of it went into your drain pan. What you'd want to do, because a little bit of fluid is going to be still leaking out, is pull it down, let gravity help you, put your catch basin underneath there, and let more hydraulic fluid drain out. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the lower shock bolt nut. It's a 19 millimeter for both. I'm going to hold the nut with a long box end 19 millimeter, and then I'm going to get on the front with my DeWalt impact gun and a 19 millimeter socket and zip it out. Okay, I just loosened it enough to where I could get the nut off. Now we want to manipulate the control arm a little bit to take a little pressure off so we're not going to damage the threads. So what we learned on the other side is if we jack up a little bit underneath the control arm, right underneath the lower ball joint, it will take a little bit of pressure off the bolt to where we can remove it. Go up a little more. There we go. He just had to jack up a little bit to take a little pressure off, and I was able to get the bolt out. You might be inclined to just start pounding on it with a skinny punch or something like that, but then you're going to end up mangling your threads because they're going to be grinding on the way out. Better to relieve pressure to get the bolt out really easy and not damage your threads. So now what we want to do is remove the top nut off of this shock absorber so we can remove it from the vehicle. You can see that there's not a lot of room to work here, and ideally, I would have a box end wrench that's 22 millimeters, sort of like this, to where it could drop in there really well. But I don't have one, so then I have to go to a socket. Well, when you get in here, you can fit a short 22 millimeter in there, but then you have problems with getting the ratchet on there. So on the other side, we started with hitting it with a ball peen hammer and bent it out to where we can get on here. But then we found that this little top part of the shaft was hindering getting a good connection of the socket on the nut, and we were scared we were going to strip it. So finally what we did is we took a Sawzall and we just cut the little top nipple right above the nut off, to where then we can get on there with the socket better and be able to loosen this thing. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to take my little M12 Milwaukee Sawzall and we're going to hack off this top part right here. Here's my little Milwaukee hacksaw, they call it, not a Sawzall. And I'm using a Diablo Demon metal cutting blade. Now, if you look right behind here, there's an electrical wiring harness that I do not want to hit and cut and basically ruin Ryan's day. So I want to be careful here. Just like that. There's still a little bit of access problem, so we are going to go ahead and take the ball peen hammer, do a few strikes right here and bend it back a little bit. So now with the fender liner bent back a little bit, now I can easily get in here with my longer half-inch drive gear inch ratchet with a plenty of mechanical advantage to loosen this. Now when I turn this, the whole shock absorber is turning, the upper part. So what Ryan is going to do for me is he's going to get on here with a big pair of channel locks, clamp onto this, holding tension this way to where when I loosen the top nut, it's going to loosen and not twist the whole thing like that. There it is. Once you break it free, unless you're dealing with rust, you should be able to get it off pretty easy. And there it is. And this thing actually still holds a lot of fluid, so be careful where you're pointing this thing when you dump it down. It's going to dump out a lot of fluid. If you bring it down right between the tie rod and the lower control arm, you can get it out. And then we'll show you how much fluid this thing still holds. Quite a bit. The top hardware is right here. So you'll see you have a centering washer, the cushion, and then you have this top piece that the fluid line bolted into. Now we're going to get the new shock absorber in. So here's your Ironman front shock absorber. You want to start off with one of these big washers with the concave side facing up to capture the bushing. Slide that on. You grab one of your rubber cushions, slide that on. You grab one of these centering washers. Again, the concave side faces the bushing. Slide that over. This little protrusion right here is going to go up into the frame member. This is a centering washer. We're going to go up through the same pathway. You can literally collapse this shock absorber. It doesn't take a whole lot of force. You can push it up and set it into the lower control arm bracket. Now on top, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to start off with a centering washer with the little nipple facing downward to go into the frame. You're going to put a cushion. You're going to put another one of the big flat washers with the concave side facing the bushing. And then you're going to come in with your 19mm nut and screw it on. Okay, that's in there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the shock aligned with the lower control arm. Like I said, you can manipulate this shock just with your arm strength, unless you're like a little weakling, and you can get the bolt started from the front going towards the back, pull up on the shock absorber, slide it through with the washer between the head of the bolt, line it up, wiggle it a little bit. There it is. Then you just get your flange nut attached to the back side. We're going to torque that lower shock bolt nut to 101 foot-pounds. So Ryan is going to work the torque wrench. We have a deep 19mm socket, and then I'm holding the back nut with a 19mm box end wrench. And it appears I don't even have to hold the nut. It's already locking in. And there it is, 101 foot-pounds. Now we're going to tighten this nut. The torque value in the factory service manual specifies a value of 51 foot-pounds for a Lexus LX470, and it specifies a torque spec of 50 for a 100 series Land Cruiser. We started using a torque wrench on the other side, and it just kept turning and turning. The bushings got really collapsed and bulging out, and we stopped at a point with about 5 threads showing above the nut. And I think that's what we're going to do too, because we were afraid that we were going to just over tighten it and really deform the bushings too much. So we're going to do the same with 5 threads showing. I'm using my 19mm ratcheting box end. I've got it fairly tight, but I'm going to go a little bit further. If you find that this starts to twist on you a little bit, you can just hold on to it and it will get to a point where it's not turning the whole shock. Right now, nothing's turning, just the nut. See how many threads I got here? It's about 4 showing. I'm going to go a little tighter than that. So both sides now have 5 full threads showing, and the nut is equal to the 6th thread on both sides. When using this long box end wrench, it does start to feel like it's getting pretty tight. We just found that with the torque wrench, it just kept going and going, and that's why we decided to stop at this amount of thread showing. Now the question is, what do you do with this fluid line? You obviously just don't want it flopping around here. So what we did on the other side, and what we're going to do on this side too, is we're basically just going to fold it, make a U, and zip tie it against itself. So get this plastic liner out of your way, and then we're just going to zip tie it just like this against itself, and hopefully it's not going to rattle around and make some noise for Ryan to hear. All right, so 1 zip tie on the bottom, 1 zip tie on the top, squeeze pretty tight, and so hopefully that's going to stay out of the way and not rattle around. Now all we have to do is just reconnect the fender liner, just push in the clips. Don't be surprised if some of these break on you, but you can get some more from Toyota if it happens. Now we're going to remove the torsion bar. We're working on the passenger side. The factory service manual suggests doing match marks, especially if you're going to reuse this torsion bar. You're taking it off for whatever reason, and you want to get it back in the same orientation. So we made a match mark on the torsion bar and carried it over to the torque arm. I also labeled the torsion bar with an F to denote that this is the front. Here's the rear connection of the torsion bar on the passenger side. I went ahead and put a P on there to label it for passenger side. I put a R to show this is the rear part of the torsion bar. And then I made a mark on the torsion bar and lined up another mark on the anchor arm. The first thing we're going to do to get the torsion bar off the vehicle is we're going to relieve tension on this anchor arm adjusting bolt. The factory service manual says to take note of where it currently sits. What we noticed when we measured the other side is when we put the straight edge across the frame member, the bolt head was recessed a little bit by about 2 millimeters. The reason why you take note of where the bolt head sits in relation to the frame member is so you can get it back in the same position without much guesswork. If you have those measurements, you can use that measurement to get the height adjustment where it was before, or very close. So now we're ready to remove the fasteners to get this torsion bar off. So this is the anchor arm adjusting bolt. It goes into the anchor arm adjusting seat, and then the end of the bolt screws into the anchor arm adjusting swivel. We need to back this bolt off to take pressure off of the torsion bar. This bolt is a 30 millimeter. I'm using my 1/2" drive gear wrench flex head ratchet with a 30 millimeter socket, and I'm going to back off this bolt. Okay, so see how I can easily turn this bolt with my hand? It's now at the point where there's no more tension on the torsion bar, and I can just remove this bolt with my hand. You got your bolt in your seat, And then the swivel is up here. You can just reach behind and pull it out. And there's the swivel. Now that we have the anchor arm loose, we're going to work on the torque arm. These nuts are 22 millimeter. I'm going to zip them off with my DeWalt impact gun. This inside bolt won't come out because it will hit the frame. So the inside one can't be removed, but the outside one can, because it runs all the way through. It's a long bolt that goes through the lower control arm. So there's that bolt on the outside. Now what we have to do is we have to grab our brass hammer. We have to tap the torque arm off of the torsion bar on the front, and then we have to tap the anchor arm on the rear of the torsion bar off. So learning from the other side, we tapped it with a brass hammer and we slowly work it up by hitting it on opposing sides. On the rear connection, you could actually push this whole assembly back far enough to where you can knock this torque arm off. Go to the back, manipulate it the way you need to manipulate it to be able to slide it back further, and then you can get enough real estate to where you can pop this off. And drop it on your chest. So now we're on the back anchor arm, and what I did is I drew the whole torsion bar assembly as forward as possible to get the anchor arm as close to this front part of this frame member. This way I can get on there with my brass hammer and hit it on opposing sides and start knocking it off. I'm going to hold on to the torsion bar to where it won't start knocking forward, and then I'll just watch to see that it's slowly working its way off. You get the idea. I'm going to work on this for a while, knocking it back and forth. A couple taps on one side, couple taps on the other side, and slowly work this anchor arm off the torsion bar. After hitting it back and forth on opposing sides, you'll finally start to see the splines, and then just keep going, and you'll finally get the thing off. I can almost wiggle this thing off now. There we go. There it is. It's off, yay! So to get this thing out, just bring the whole torsion bar forward and clear this cross member. Just like that. Okay. To prep the torque arm and the anchor arm for the new torsion bar from Ironman, we want to clean up these splines really nicely. So I'm just going to use some brake cleaner, and then I'm just going to use a little wire brush. You could use brass, you could use metal, and then just get in there and clean up the splines really well. So when you put these on the new torsion bar, they're going to slide on really easily. And we're also going to be applying some multi-purpose grease to these splines just to make the assembly much easier. Spray a little brake cleaner in there, get your brush, work it in there, and keep doing that to where the splines are really clean. So with the anchor arm and the torque arm, there's one tooth in here that is missing, and it's like a double wide. So I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but it's right there. There's a bigger gap than the other one, so it's basically missing a spline. And the same thing with this arm. You can see that there's a bigger gap right here. Now let's go over to the OEM torsion bar and show you how these made up. On the actual splines on the torsion bar, if the paint hasn't worn away, you'll still be able to see a white paint mark, which is the alignment mark that you need to match up with the wide tooth on either the anchor arm or the torsion arm. If you get a little screwdriver in here and you push in here, it's some type of sealant material. It's not metal. It's just some type of sealant that they fill it in to where you won't be able to mate it up, because this sealant will stop you if you are misaligned. You would align the spot that has a missing tooth with this one that has the sealant in between the splines, and then you can marry them up. So I just wanted to show you that it's hard to mess this up. They do this so you can't misalign the two pieces. With these torsion bar markings, there's an offset. The offset is a difference of 5 teeth. If you put a straight edge, I'm using this carpenter's level, if you put it on the edge of the rear tooth, you can see that it's right there, it's white a little bit. If I rotate that in line with the straight edge of the level, and then when you come forward here, it's gonna be 5 teeth off. So if you count up, it would be 5 teeth. That's the offset with the OEM torsion bars. With these Ironman torsion bars, it also provides a white mark. There's now no longer any like filling or adhesive between the teeth, but they mark it with a nice white mark. If I rotate it to where it's in line with the carpenter's level, the inside tooth, and then when we look forward on the front, you can see there's basically 3 gaps getting to the white mark. 1, 2, 3. So there is a different offset with these Ironman torsion bars, and maybe it's because it's a beefier arm and it doesn't need the same offset. That's the best guess I have. Ironman does stamp these right hand and left hand. Right hand is the passenger side, left hand is the driver's side. And when it comes to which end is the rear and which end is the front, they put an R showing that that's the rear. We're going to utilize a little bit of multi-purpose grease to make the joining of the parts easier. So I'm just going to smear some grease on the anchor arm and the torque arm, and then I'm going to put a little bit of grease on the actual male splines of the torsion bar too. So that's what we're going to do right now. So now that we have both pieces lubricated really well, I'm going to slide it on. I've made a match mark. Don't pay attention to this one right here, but the one closer to me, that lines up with the wide area where the missing tooth is, and that area needs to match up where this white mark is on the Ironman torsion bar. So line them up and slide them together just like that. This other mark was the original match mark I made before I took off the OEM arm. So now we're going to get this thing under the rig and we're going to get the other arm on. So now we're going to reverse our procedure that we did to get the bar out. We're going to start by going over the cross member and feeding it forward. Just like that. And you can just balance it in here for a second. And then now we're going to get the anchor arm connected. On the front end, the torque arm is not connected up to the lower control arm yet. We need it loose in order to get this anchor arm in first. So you want to have the arm dip down in the front to where it gives you enough room to fit in this anchor arm, fit it in, and then match up your match marks and then slide them together. There it is, it's slid in. Now we're going to go back to the front and get the front connected. You want to push the whole assembly back as far as you can, and then you can get the bolts started. Remember, the big bolt comes in from the front towards the back, and then we have to push it a little bit closer this way. All right, once you got your bolts through, then just get your nuts started. If you remove the swivel off the frame member, just put it back in. And just so you know, this swivel, this hole is offset. If you happen to take it off like we did, you would want to mark which side is the rear. So the offset is more towards the front. So just know that you could mess this up. You wouldn't want to get it on in the wrong orientation. I went ahead and put a little bit of multi-purpose grease in here. I'm just going to flop it up in here. Sits right in there into the grooves, and then we're going to get our bolt and the other part in. I went ahead and put a little multi-purpose grease on the end of the bolt too, just to make the assembly a little smoother. You can reach your hand and hold the swivel steady while you're aligning the bolt. We did forget to mention that this Ironman kit comes with a lower control arm reinforcement. Because these torsion bars are beefier than the OEM, they felt it was necessary to add a little reinforcement. So what you do is you get this plate on, it's an L shape, in between the torque arm and the lower control arm. When you're getting ready to align the torque arm with the lower control arm, you're going to want to get the plate in between and then slide your bolts through. We're going to now torque these to spec. These nuts need to be torqued to 166 foot-pounds. I'm first just going to cinch them up with a 1/2 inch ratchet. You want to tighten them slowly and evenly. That one went. Ugh. The Ironman directions now tell you to drill a hole through this first one with a 10mm drill bit. I don't have any millimeter drill bits, but we did a conversion and we found that a 25/64 drill bit is about the same size. We're going to drill the hole, put the bolt and the nut and the washers on, and tighten that up, and then we're going to drill the second one. You want to make sure and use eye protection so you don't get a metal bit in your eye, and just start drilling. No need to use a center punch or anything like that. I'm just going to let the hole be my guide and just get a look to see if I'm drilling pretty square, and it looks like I'm drilling square. When you get the first hole drilled, you want to get a bolt with a lock washer, flat washer, and then the flange nut on top, and you cinch it up. You torque the first one and the torque spec is 35 foot-pounds. Then you get your drill and you drill the second one, just using the hole in the bracket as a guide. Again, I'm gonna put the lock washer on first, flat washer, slide it up through, and then get my flange nut on. The size of the bolt and the nut are a 16mm. I don't know what the fractional equivalent is, but the 16mm works fine for this. Okay, it's cinched up, and now I'm going to break out the torque wrench. And it's torqued at 35 foot-pounds. So we're going to bring this back to the original spec that we saw, which was when we took a measurement of the bolt head in relation to the frame member, it was sticking down a couple millimeters. And the reason why I think that is that there's more weight on the driver's side because of the fuel tank. And so that one would be turned in more to create more torque on the torsion bar to lift that side up higher. And this side, because it's lighter, doesn't need to be tightened as much, so it sits a little bit lower. So there's basically about a 4mm difference when you look at it, because on the other side, this was recessed 2mm in relation to the frame member, and on this side that's sticking down 2mm, so about a 4mm difference. Using a flat ruler, I put it on the bolt, and then I look at the distance between the ruler and the frame member back here, and it still looks like I need to tighten it a little more. That looks like closer to like 3 or 4mm, and I want it about 2mm. So I'm going to keep on tightening it, and then recheck the measurement, and that looks about right. We're going to start there. We're going to finish by taking a measurement from the ground to the fender to get the vehicle riding equal on both sides. We're done with the front. Now we're going to work on the rear. You want to get the spare tire down and out of your way so you have more room to work in the back. What you do is you take this plastic cover off your bumper. It's right underneath this lift gate, and then that gives you an access to get onto the spare tire winch. I've already got it connected. I'm not going to show you what it looks like now because I don't want to have to struggle to get it realigned again. It's a little bit hard. You have to use a light and guide it to where you need to and get on it, and then rotate it lefty-loosey and bring it to the ground. I'll show you what the special socket looks like when we get it down. When you get the tire all the way to the ground, just keep on loosening the cable enough to where you can reach your hand in here, turn it like this, and free it. And then you just drag your tire out from underneath the vehicle. to keep that cable and that connector that captures the spare tire out of the way, I'm just going to tighten this and bring the cable back up into the winch. So I'm just giving a little counter pressure so the cable doesn't spool up there really loose. Just to give you an idea, this is what the end looks like right here. Okay, you get the idea. So now we're going to jack up the rear end. We're going to jack right up underneath the rear axle, and then we're going to support the frame on both frame rails with 6-ton jack stands. I've got the front wheels chalked so it can't move anywhere. In order to get more movement out of the rear end so we can get the springs out and for the shocks to be able to clear the lower mount, we want to disconnect the sway bar either here or here to where we can rotate it down and get it out of the way of the shock absorber, and so it's not holding any tension on the rear end, so we can flex it more to get the springs out. I'm choosing to disconnect it at this point on both sides. It's a 14mm bolt and nut that captures this end link that attaches to the frame. I'm just using a couple box end wrenches to do it. So once you have both bolts out of the end link, you can just rotate the sway bar down out of your way. Now you have nothing stopping you from pulling the shock absorber off. Now that we have the sway bar out of the way, we're going to work on removing the rear shocks. Just like the front, we first want to depressurize the system. So there's 2 more dampening actuator pods further back on the frame, and you want to bleed both of those. Each one of those goes to one of the rear shocks. Then you have to do the same procedure and get the fluid line disconnected from the top of the shock absorber. It's the same size fasteners. It's a 12mm bolt. The front one's a little bit easier to get to with my 1/4 inch flex head gear wrench ratchet with a short 12mm socket. The back one is a little bit harder. So I'm on the front one right now, but with the rear one, you have to go over the top of the fitting and then get it on there, and you can do it. I just did it, and so it's possible, but a flex head makes it a lot easier than a standard wrench. So I'm on it right now, and there's just enough room to turn it to loosen it up. So that's how you get the 12mm bolts that hold the fluid line to the shock absorber loose and off. I got both the bolts out. The rear one is pretty hard on this passenger side. On the driver's side, I was able to loosen them and then be able to reach over the top to get the back nut with my fingers, but this side you have more stuff in your way, so I basically had to painstakingly use the 1/4 inch ratchet to back the back bolt out all the way. And then now both bolts are out. Same thing as the front. You need to pry up the fluid line off of the shock absorber. I'm just using a little Mayhew pry bar, getting underneath there and then using a little leverage to pop it up. It's moved a little bit. I'm going to see if I can get it the rest of the way by hitting the end of the pry bar with a hammer. And there we go, it's out now. You can see that the fluid fitting is now off the top of the shock absorber. So right there is a sensor wire. It's an ABS sensor wire that I disconnected, and I tucked it out of the way right there because we're going to use the same technique in order to have more room to get the socket over the top 22mm nut. We're going to take the Sawzall and cut the top of that nipple off, and then have more room to get the ratchet and socket onto that nut. Now that we got the fluid line disconnected from the top of the shock absorber, we're going to remove the lower shock bolt. It's a 17mm. I'm going to zip it out with my DeWalt gun. Once the bolt is out, you can get a little pry bar, a big screwdriver, get it in between the shock absorber and the frame mount, and pry outward to free it of its post. There we go. On the driver's side, I had a little more room to work. I was able to get a bigger ratchet with a lot more mechanical advantage onto the top nut. On this passenger side, I had to use a smaller ratchet that had a little bit lower profile, and I was able to get up onto that 22mm nut. Then we used the same procedure of one guy holds the shock body with a big channel lock so it doesn't spin, while the other person works the ratchet and loosens it. Once you get it loose, you have a choice. You can keep on loosening it from the top via the ratchet, or you can just spin the shock body while holding the ratchet and get the nut loose that way. It's your choice. So here's us employing the technique where I'm just holding the ratchet steady and Ryan's getting up on the shock body and just twisting lefty-loosey and loosening it. Go ahead, Ryan. And there it is, it's out.
Don't forget, there's a lot of fluid in these shocks.
Yeah, don't just go ahead and start tipping it over. You want to go over your catch basin and pour it in there. Now that we have both shock absorbers out, the next thing we want to do to make it easier to get the springs out is disconnect the panhard bar on the passenger side. It's a 24mm bolt and nut. I'm just going to get on here with my DeWalt gun, deep 24mm socket, and zip this nut off. Once you get the nut off, you can start jacking up under the rear end. As you jack it up and get the panhard bar a little more parallel, it seems to make this bracket hole align better with the bolt. We got it up pretty much maxed out. It's still not perfect to get the bolt out easy. I'm just going to finish getting it out with a brass drift and a plastic mallet. So now that we have the panhard bar disconnected from the passenger side, we're going to lower the rear end down far enough to where we can flex the rear end one way, get one spring out, then flex it the other way and get the other spring out. So here we go. When you're doing this, you want to be mindful of the brake line. You don't want the brake line to get really tight, and you also don't want your parking brake on right now, so you want your parking brake off. So with the parking brake off, you can see that this has a lot of movement. If you had it set, it would allow less movement in the rear end. So I'm going to keep on going down, paying attention mainly to the brake line, also looking at this breather line too. Okay, that breather line's getting pretty taut. Let's see if that's going to be enough to flex the rear end and get the springs out. So you can sit here and just lean your body weight on here while you're pulling up on the spring, and you can get it out. Just like that. You want to compare the springs and figure out which one is taller. So this one right here is obviously taller, and you want to put that spring on the driver's side. Because of the weight of the gas tank and the weight of the fuel, it's gonna make that driver's side sag a little bit. So put the taller of the two springs on the driver's side. We noticed this brake line was getting a little bit too tight for our comfort to get this spring in on the driver's side. So what I did is I removed this little clip that holds the brake line to this bracket on the axle housing, and then now there's a little bit more flex, and we're going to be paying attention that we're not going to bend this line, but we just want a little bit more room to where we're not cranking on this rubber line and we tear it and break it. Because the differential is a little bit offset towards the passenger side, Ryan came up with a good idea. We want to lower the jack a little bit more so we can get the passenger side down lower. So what he thought of is he put a 3-ton jack underneath the axle housing on the driver's side, and then now we can lower the rear end a little bit more and get the passenger side to tilt down more. Just like that. Okay, it looks like we could probably get that spring out now. So same thing on the passenger side. I'm going to lean up against here a little bit. Actually, I don't even have to lean up against it. We have the rear end down so much, I can just pick this up and slide it out. There we go. With a little bit of extra movement out of the brake line now, we were able to get the rear end a lot lower. You just get this in here like so, and then rotate it in here. When you get this rear end really low, these springs are going to go in really easy. And then you just rotate it in to where the spring is against the stop here. I'll show you. You can see the stop that the end of the spring needs to rest up against on the top of the axle housing, and then you know you have it in the right position. So now we're going to get the shock absorbers in. The setup for these rear shocks is the same as the front. You get one of the washers on first with the concave side facing up. I put a little Mission silicone paste on the rod right here to where it will be easier to slide the rubber bushing over. It's a little bit tight. And then you get one of the centering washers with a little nipple facing upward, and then we're going to slide this up into the frame. For the lower shock mount, you just put these rubber bushings in. The tapered end goes in right here, and you could also lubricate the inside diameter of the rubber bushing with a little silicone paste so it slides over the frame post easier. So I'm going to film from underneath the truck. I'm going to let Ryan install the shock absorber. Okay, then he's going to push up on the shock and then slide it over the post. Just like that. The first thing we're going to put on top is one of the centering washers with the nipple facing the frame. So reach up over the top here and slide it on. The next thing we're going to do is get one of the rubber bushings and slide that over the top, followed by another washer with the concave side facing the bushing. Then you want to get this big washer on top, and then you want to get your nylon lock nut started. What we're using to tighten the top nut is a 19mm flex head box end wrench. You can at first get it started, and then if you have a helper, they could hold on to the shock body, and it works for a little bit, but then the whole thing starts to turn on you. To get a little bit more of the stem showing above the nut to where you can get on it with a crescent wrench to hold it, what Ryan's going to do is he's going to grab onto the top part of the shock where there's a solid piece of metal, hold it with the channel locks while I can get it just a little bit tighter. So you can see the setup. Ryan is holding the top of the shock with a big channel locks, the same channel locks we used to get the front shocks free, and then I'm going to work the ratchet. As more of the stem is exposed, then I can let Ryan let go of the shock with the channel locks, and then I can get a crescent wrench up onto the top part of the shaft to hold it steady while I tighten the nut. So here's the setup. Once you get the nut down far enough, you can get on the top of the shaft with the crescent wrench on those flat sides. You hold the shaft firm with the crescent wrench while you're working the ratcheting 19mm, and you can get the nut tight. We've got the upper shock bolts tight on the rear. Now we want to tighten the lower shock bolt. It's torqued to 72 foot-pounds. Now we're going to get the sway bar reconnected. You go in the front side with the bolt and a nut on the other side. We're now tightening up the nuts for the sway bar. I know there's a torque spec for this, but I'm not going to worry too much. I'm just going to cinch them up nice and snug, and that's good. Now we're going to get the lateral control arm, also known as the panhard bar, reconnected to the passenger side frame. You can utilize a pry bar between the lateral control arm and the frame piece here to flex it and move it the way you want to. Another thing you can use is these big old alignment tools. So you can get it in here and manipulate it to where the holes of the panhard bar line up well with the frame. Once it looks good, you get your bolt in from the back side, slide it in as far as you can, and then we'll look from this orientation and see what we have to do further. So now looking from this end, I could see that it's not remotely close to lining up. So I'm going to get this alignment tool in here and crank to where I can get it lined up better. So we got it most of the way in. Now we're just going to finish it with the mallet. Go ahead. And we got it through. For the torquing of the ladder control on bolt and nut, we don't want to tighten it until we get the weight of the vehicle settled on the wheels. So at that point, when it's in a neutral position, that's when we'll torque that to spec. We have the weight of the truck on all four wheels now. Now we're going to torque the lateral control arm bolt nut to 111 foot-pounds. And there it is, 111 foot-pounds. Now that we're done with all the work in the rear, you can get your spare tire back up underneath the vehicle and winch it up. We didn't show it, we already did it, but we assumed that you could figure it out since you were able to get the spare tire down. So get that up underneath the vehicle and winched up tight. Now what you want to do is you want to start taking some measurements to see where your ride height is. With the rear is pretty much set based off of the springs. We put the taller spring on the driver's side because of the weight of the fuel tank. You can't make any adjustments in the rear, but you can make adjustments in the front with those bolts on the torsion bars. You go around with a tape measure and you start measuring from the floor, or you can measure from the center, but we're going to measure from the ground to the edge of the fender, center on the wheel. And you do that on all 4 tires, and then you figure out, okay, one side is low. What we found with Ryan's rig is the driver's side front was low and the passenger side rear was high. To make the adjustments to the torsion bars, you want to take the weight of the vehicle off the suspension, at least most of it. You don't have to get the wheels off the ground, but you want to take a lot of the weight off to where it's not going to be hard to turn the adjusting bolt. So we again jacked up right underneath this main cross member under the engine and took weight off. And then I'll show you where we made the adjustment. With most of the weight off the suspension, I made the adjustment right here. So if you turn this bolt clockwise, that increases the torque on the torsion bar and will raise that side. So what we did is we would give this a bunch of turns, maybe 10 turns. We would lower the vehicle back to the ground and recheck the measurements at the wheel wells. And we kept on doing that to where we got the front end equal. And as we got the front end equal, that changed the measurement in the back. So as we raised the driver's side front, the passenger side rear came down, and we got the front and the rear with equal measurements. As it sits right now, we have a 2-inch positive rake, which means that the rear is 2 inches higher than the front. And that's basically kind of a normal thing that you will see with vehicles that come from the factory, Toyota being one of them, is they put a positive rake to where when you load down your cargo area with cargo or camping gear or whatever you're carrying, it will bring the rear down level and not cause a sagging situation. If you, say for instance, had it perfectly level, as soon as you load down the rear cargo area with a bunch of weight, now you're going to be sagging in the rear and your headlights are going to be pointing up at people and blinding them. So we suggest that you finish with a positive rake, the rear higher than the front. All right, so we're done with all the mechanical portion of this job, but there is a electrical portion of this job. Because the automatic height control is an electronic system, Ryan's not going to want to have all these lights lit up on his dash when the computer's freaking out that this system's not working properly. There's some discrepancy on the right thing to do to avoid having things lighting up on your dash like a Christmas tree showing that something's wrong. Some guys will pull the fuses that power the automatic height control system and also disconnect power to the ECU that powers the automatic height control system inside the vehicle. What we found on the forums, IHateMud.com being one of them, is that people have reported that they don't have to disconnect the fuses, but if they just disconnect the plugs to the ECU underneath the dash, that will stop any lights coming on in your dash and it disables the whole system. So that's what Ryan and I are going to do. We're not going to pull any fuses for the automatic height control system inside the engine compartment or inside the vehicle. We're just going to get underneath the dash and disconnect all the electrical plugs to that ECU to disable the system. The ECU sits back in this area, so we want to get this panel out of our way and some other stuff out of our way so we can get to the electrical plugs on that ECU. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull this piece back towards you, towards the steering wheel. It's just held in with some clips, so grab onto it, work it back, and it'll pop free. There we go. You can see it's free now, and you could just leave this hanging there. You don't have to take it off all the way. You can disconnect this dimmer switch plug if you want, but we don't have to do that. So the next thing we're going to do is we want to remove this bottom panel, and it's held on mostly with clips, but there is one fastener we have to remove, and there's a tiny little bolt that you can get off with a socket or with a Phillips head or JIS screwdriver. And the weather stripping overlaps this part of the panel. To get the weather stripping out, we want to remove this little kick panel cover, and to get that kick panel cover off, we first have to remove this because there's an overlap right here. So I'm just going to get under here with my fingers and pull this piece up, and then I can pull this piece back. This might happen to you. The clip stayed inside the body. We'll be able to pop that out though. To get this one out, you just reach your hand the back and just pull backwards. And this little plug goes in right here and goes over a little metal post. This footrest just goes over a couple little metal posts, and you can pull this straight out too. The metal posts go right into these holes, and you can see the two little metal posts that it sits on, and then this other one right there, that's where the kick panel post was that the plastic clip was holding it down with. I'm going to pull this weather stripping up now. Just loosen it. You don't have to pull it off all the way. The next thing I'm going to do is remove this 8mm bolt that holds this plastic panel to the body. I'm going to use my Milwaukee gun to zip it out. With that one 8mm bolt removed, the rest of what's holding this panel in is clips. So you just get back here and start pulling, and you'll start freeing it. And I'm going to go over to the side here and start pulling it free. It's pretty easy. Clear the weather stripping. Now you got all these controls for your rear vents and the mirror control, so you don't want to pull on them too hard. You want to start getting them free. These are a little bit tough to remove, but you'll get it. You just got to push the tab and wiggle it and get it out. What I don't suggest you do is resort to getting on these with a needle nose pliers or other type of pliers, because you'll end up breaking it. So just be patient, squeeze the tab you need to, and remove all the plugs. You get the idea. We're going to keep doing this. There's also one electrical connector on this side you got to release. Now you can drop this down to the floor. There is two other things you could disconnect and be able to pull this out all the way. It's for your hood release and your gas hatch release, but we're not going to bother doing that because I've done it before in other vehicles. It ends up being a little bit of a pain in the butt to get them back in. So just lay this down on the ground. The next thing we want to get out of the way is this metal plate. It's held on with 4 10mm bolts, and I'm going to zip them out with my Milwaukee ratchet. The next thing we want to get out of the way is this ventilation tube for your heater and your AC. It's held in with one 8mm bolt right here. What you want to do is you want to pull the air tube out from this side first, pull it back to the right, and get it free. Once you got it free of this side, then you want to pull it free of the right side, and it'll pop right out. When you pull this out, you want to rotate it towards you, and it will clear the plastic trim. And now it's out of your way. The automatic height control ECU is right here on the right side next to the center console. There's 3 electrical plugs you have to disconnect, and once you do that, you have disabled the system. It might be a little bit of a fight, but you just push the release button and pull back, and you can get them out. It's a little tight in here. So that's all 3 removed. The reassembly is the reverse of the way you took things out. We're going to put the air tube back in. You want to get the right side connected first, rotate it in place. Just be careful not to capture any wires. Push it in all the way to the right and get it connected on the left side. And then once you got it into here, pull it back to the left and seat it in. You'll feel it pop in, and now the air tube is back connected properly. You want to get your 8mm bolt back in. Just cinch it up snug. Just know that this is plastic You don't want to go too tight and strip it. Now we're going to get the metal plate back in. The metal plate has these little tabs, so I'm going to get the bottom left corner in first, get this tab in place. It hooks in there, and then rotate it in, and just like that, and get the bolt started. When you get this metal plate in place, make sure that you're not capturing one of the wires behind it. So you want this wire that was closer to the center console poking through this part of the metal plate. I'm going to cinch up the 4 10mm bolts with my 1/4 inch ratchet. These you can get a little tighter because they are going into metal, but I still wouldn't go too tight. Just snug them up with a light amount of torque and call it good. Now we're going to get this plastic panel back connected, and we got to get our electrical connectors connected first. So I'm going to get this one on the right side first connected, snap it in, and then I'm going to snap in these other ones. These switches just plug in kind of lightly, so just pop it back in. Okay, all 4 connectors are connected on this driver's side of the panel. When getting this panel back in, what I'm doing is I'm looking down below and I'm aligning the clips. So I'm getting the 2 lower clips started in their corresponding holes, and then you want to pay attention to the wiring. So you want to kind of like tuck it back where it's not going to be jamming up against anything, and you just align the top clips and you just snap it towards the dash, and it's all back in. I'm gonna push the weather stripping back in place, and then this top trim piece above the steering wheel just pops back by pushing away from yourself, just like that. We got to get this screw in this left corner here. This is again going into plastic. Don't tighten it too tight. That's good. Now we're going to get this kick panel cover in. So you have this rear stud that this hole has to go over, and then see over here there's a little metal clip right here, and you want this piece right here to go into that metal clip. There's 2 of them. There's one here and one here, and that locks it into this side. There we go, it's locked in. You take your little plug and you just push it over the top of that post. Now we got to get the footrest in. You just have to line up these holes with the studs and push down. And there it is. So then you want to just snap this trim piece back in. You line up the clips and then push downward. And so if the information we got from the forums is correct, just unplugging the automatic high control ECU and not actually pulling the fuses that power the system, we're not going to get any lights lighting up on the dash saying something is wrong. And it looks like it's good. All we have is a seatbelt light blinking, which it looks like the information we got is correct. All you have to do is unplug the ECU for the automatic high control system and you're good to go. We didn't show you at the beginning of the video, but this is what the skid plates look like. This is the rear one that's plastic, and this is the front one that's metal. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get these reconnected. Again, I'm not going to bother filming it because it's self-explanatory. They're both just held on to the frame with a bunch of 12mm bolts right there. All right, we're all done with this job. It was a little bit tedious because it's kind of tight to get onto the top of those shock absorbers, to get the fluid lines disconnected, to get the top shock nut off. And so it was a little bit of a test of patience. It was trial and error for us. Starting with the front, we realized that when we got a short socket on top of that top shock nut, we couldn't get the ratchet on there because the little nipple on the top of the shock was impeding on the ratchet going in. So what we came up with is taking a Sawzall and just taking off that top little nipple to where we can get on there with the short socket with the ratchet, and then effectively loosen that top nut and get it off. And we found we had to do the same with the rear. we could not get enough room to get that socket in there, so we nipped off the very top nipple of the shock absorber, and then we were able to get in there. The rear is much harder than the front, but you can get onto those top little 12mm bolts that hold the fluid lines. If you have a flex head 1/4" ratchet, you need something small. I don't think you're going to be able to get in there with the 3/8 ratchet, but maybe you could. I just know that I was able to get in there with a 1/4" ratchet with a little bit of patience. I wish we would have showed you how much fluid comes out when you first bleed off either one of the front dampening actuators or one of the rear dampening actuators. A lot of fluid comes out. So when you crack that thing, you definitely want to have a hose directing that stream of hydraulic fluid into a catch basin. If you have it just going straight out, it's going to go all over the place and maybe right in your face, which would be a bad thing. Definitely use a hose for that part. What we notice is when you drain one of the front ones or one of the rear ones, the opposing side isn't going to generate any fluid coming out at all for the most part. Other than dealing with the shock absorbers, which were kind of hard to get out because of those fluid lines, the rest of it was fairly straightforward. The same type of struggle you would have on any lift, by flexing the rear end to get the springs out and then getting it all back together. It's pretty similar in that respect. The main difference with this one is dealing with those fluid lines and dealing with getting those upper shock nuts off. Those were the hardest parts of this job. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan, and Ryan's going to explain how the suspension is handling now with this new Ironman 4x4 kit.
So I've had about an hour of drive time now on this suspension by Ironman 4x4, and I have to say it's awesome. I really like it, and compared to the standard stock Lexus hydraulic suspension, I have to say it's probably comparable to driving around in the medium comfort setting, which, if anybody drives the Lexus around, is very comfortable. The only problem with that is there's tons of body lean and sway, especially when you're in corners or you're driving around the city. It feels very sloppy. But with this lift kit, it eliminated all of that sloppiness that you normally feel on a standard Lexus suspension. So I have to say, I give this a thumbs up. I can't comment on the Old Man Emu lift, but I have to say, while driving on the freeway, this felt great. Very isolated drive. Feels very, very comfortable and compliant. I have to thank Timmy for all the help that he did on this vehicle. This was definitely, in my personal opinion, more difficult than putting a lift kit on my old 4Runner. I'm really glad that Timmy helped me out with this one because it is great. So thumbs up, and next time.
So as you heard from Ryan, the result was very positive in his opinion, and he's very happy with the Ironman 4x4 suspension upgrade that he did to his Lexus LX470. With all that said, we thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Ryan. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. Sick mods and sick suspension upgrades. Peace out. Bye-bye.